If you're enjoying this journey into the mysteries, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover more hidden secrets, haunted stories, and thrilling tales just like this one. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. Hear this as the warning it is. Not as a ghost story, though there are ghosts enough in what follows. If ghosts is what you call the persistence of violent things in the places where the violence occurred, which is a definition of ghost that the 19th century South could have filled a library with. Not as a tale of the supernatural, though what is more supernatural than 100,000 dead bodies in a landscape that then went on building houses and planting gardens and calling itself at peace. Hear it as a historical warning, which is the most precise category for what it is. The record of what happens when a society decides that the ending of a war is the same as the ending of what the war was about, and builds its houses on the assumption that if the foundation is deep enough, what is underneath it will stay underneath it. It will not stay underneath it. It has never stayed underneath it. This is the warning. This is the thing that the door at Carver's Landing was built to acknowledge, in the only language available to a man who had done what Edmund Carver had done, and who did not have the words for it, and who expressed his understanding of it in the only way that a builder can express what he knows, in the architecture itself, in the specific design of the cellar, in the rule that he gave to his wife the night before he died, and that she kept for 30 years without fully understanding it, until Delia Marsh came to the house in the autumn of 1895, and read the ground the way the ground had always been trying to be read. One door, one rule, never let it close. This is what was behind it. Edmund Carver came home to Virginia in September of 1865, having survived 4 years of a war that had killed 600,000 men, and having survived specifically, which was a different thing from surviving generally, the same way guilt is different from grief, the same way knowing is different from understanding. He came home to the Carver land in Culpeper County, which had been the Carver land for 2 generations, and was now the Carver land again in the specific sense of land that has been fought over, and has come back to its original owner damaged, with the specific damage that battlefields carry, which is not the damage of storms or fires or the ordinary violences of time, but the damage of a place where human beings have done deliberate and extreme things to each other, and the doing of it has left something in the soil. The original Carver house had been burned in 1863, and the fields with it and the outbuildings and the kitchen garden and the orchard that his father had planted, and that had been his father's particular pride. He had come home to chimneys and foundations and the specific silence of a landscape that has been used as a battlefield and is not yet recovered. The silence that is not the absence of sound but the presence of a particular kind of emptiness, as if the air itself has been wrung out and has not yet been refilled. He had money. This is important. He had money from sources that the post-war accounting of his estate would describe as business investments in the final years of the war, and which the ledgers he kept in his methodical way documented accurately in terms of what the money was spent on and not accurately in terms of where it came from, because the where was something that the ledgers were not designed to record. He had enough money to build. He began building immediately in the autumn of 1865, before the ground had finished processing what had been done to it, before the Reconstruction had been organized into anything like a coherent framework, before anything about the next period of his life had been determined, except that he was going to build on the Carver land, and he was going to build it on the specific spot, and he was going to build it with the specific cellar, and the specific room behind the specific door, because these things had been settled in him before he came home, settled in the way that certain decisions settle in a person who has done something that cannot be undone, and has decided on the form of the rest of their life in relation to that thing. He was 41 years old. He had been a Confederate officer, a captain of engineers. He was precise, methodical, competent with structures and dimensions, and the physics of how things were held up and how they were held down. He was not a man given to grand statements or to explanations. He was a man who expressed what he knew through what he built. He built the house in 11 months, using labor from the county freedmen who were working for wages in the specific uncertain economy of 1865 Reconstruction, Virginia. Men who had been enslaved on the Carver land and on the surrounding lands and who were now paid and now free, and who needed the work and who were. Judith Carver would note in the record book she began the year after her arrival. The most skilled workers on the construction, the men whose knowledge of the land and of how to build on it was the foundation of everything Edmund erected, even as Edmund was the one whose name went on the deed. The cellar was the first thing he built. Before the main structure, before the foundation walls for the upper floors, before any of the domestic architecture of the house itself. He designed it himself in his engineer's precise drawings, and he directed its construction with a personal attention he did not give equally to every element of the house. He delegated the upper floors to his foreman. He delegated the garden layout. He delegated the outbuildings. The cellar he supervised daily, and the specific room at the cellar's north end, and the door of the room at the cellar's north end, he built with his own hands. The men who worked alongside him on the cellar noted things. Judith knew this because she spoke to them, later, in the first years of her residence at Carver's Landing, and they told her what they had noted with the careful precision of people describing something they did not fully understand and were not certain they were supposed to describe. They noted the depth of the excavation, which was deeper than a standard cellar required. They noted the specific way the floor at the north end of the cellar was prepared, not flagged like the rest of the cellar floor, but laid with a particular dense clay that was not the local clay, that Edmund had brought from somewhere they did not know, that he mixed and applied himself in a process of several days, alone, in the deepest part of the excavation. They noted that after he had laid the clay floor, he stood on it for a long time before he let anyone else into the space. One man told Judith, 20 years later, that standing in that cellar while Edmund stood on the clay floor had the quality of standing near a man at a grave. That Edmund's face, which was not a face that showed much, had shown something in those minutes that the worker had recognized and had not been able to name and had not forgotten. He said, it was like a man finishing something, like a man putting something where it needed to go and saying what needed to be said to it. He said, I don't know what was in that ground, but he did. The door was the last thing Edmund built in the cellar. He made it from white oak, old wood, seasoned, dense, not fresh cut. He made the hinges himself from iron, at the forge he had set up in the rebuilt outbuilding, and the hinges were not the standard hinges of domestic cabinetry, but something heavier, more permanent. The hinges of something intended to exist for a very long time and to function continuously. He hung the door in the opening he had built in the north wall, which was the thickest wall of the cellar, 2 feet of stone, and he adjusted the hang of it with the care of a man for whom the hang mattered precisely. And then he left it open by 6 inches, and he put down the tools, and he did not enter the room behind the door. The room behind the door was not furnished. It was empty stone, walls, floor, ceiling. The floor of the room was the clay floor he had laid himself. The room had no window, no other opening, no lamp fixture. It was a room designed to be empty and open to the cellar by the width of 6 inches of door gap, and that was all it was designed to be. Judith asked him about the room twice in their 4 years of marriage before his death. The first time, shortly after her arrival at Carver's Landing in the spring of 1867, she asked what the room was for, because she was a practical woman and practical women ask what rooms are for. He said it was for storage, which was not true and which they both knew was not true, because no one stored anything in a room with a clay floor behind a door that was left permanently ajar. The second time, 3 years later, she asked more directly. She said, Edmund, what is in that room? He looked at her for a long time. He said, nothing that you can see. She said, then what is it that can't be seen? He said, what didn't go anywhere? What doesn't go anywhere? And he got up from the table and he did not speak further on the subject, and she did not ask a third time. He died in the summer of 1871. A fever, which was the common instrument of death in post-war Virginia, which was not a place of great medical resource in the first decade after the war, which was a place where a man of 47 who had been through 4 years of a war and had been carrying something heavy in his body since he came home could be taken by a fever, without the fever being the whole of what killed him. He was not surprised by the dying, which was the observation the doctor made afterward to Judith, with the particular delicacy of a physician who has learned to communicate the quality of his patient's passing, without stating directly what that quality implied. He was not surprised. He had been expecting it the way men expect things they have been waiting for. The night before he died, in the specific clarity that the dying sometimes have when the fever breaks briefly and lets them back into themselves, he told Judith the rule. He held her hand and he said, "The door in the cellar. You know the one." She said she knew. He said, "Never let it close." She said, "I know you leave it open." He said, "More than leave it. It is not a preference. It is a requirement. Do you understand the difference?" She said she did because she was Judith Carver and she understood the difference. He said, "If it closes, even for a moment, you will know because the house will know." He said, "Open it again immediately." He said, "This is the thing I need you to do. This is the only thing I am asking you." She said she would do it. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't know how to tell you what needed to be explained for the rule to make sense. And now I'm out of time." She said, "Tell me what you can." He said, "There are men in the ground, not just below the room, below the whole of the north end of the property, into the field past the garden wall, from the fighting in '63. They were not moved when they should have been moved. I knew they were there before I built. I built the cellar where I built it because of where they are, because of the specific place, the center of it. I built the room because it needed to be acknowledged. I built the door to keep the connection between what's above ground and what's below it." He paused. He said, "The door being open is the acknowledgement. The door being closed is the lie. You understand? The house is the lie and the door open is the only true thing in the house. And if you close the door, you have made the whole thing a lie, the house and the ground and what is in the ground. And what is in the ground does not tolerate the lie." He said, "I know this because I tried it once. In the first winter before you came, I closed the door to see what would happen." He did not say what happened. He said only, "Open it again immediately if it closes. Open it immediately." He died the following afternoon. Judith was with him. She held his hand while it went cold, the way that Nora Maguire had held her mother's hand in County Clare 24 years before, the way that women have held the hands of the dying since hands existed. Then she went to the cellar. She opened the door, which was already open by its 6 inches, and she pushed it open by 12, and she stood in the cellar doorway and she looked into the dark room and she said, aloud, to whatever was in the room or below the room or in the ground below the room. He told me, "I'm going to keep it open." Then she pulled the door back to its 6 inches and she went upstairs. The record book was Judith's idea, not Edmund's. She began it in the September of 1871, 2 months after Edmund's death, and she maintained it for 24 years, until Delia Marsh arrived in October of 1895. It was a large leather-bound ledger of the kind used for household accounts, and it served double duty. The household accounts on the right-hand pages, maintained with the precise regularity of a woman who had managed a large household since the age of 20, and who had no intention of letting death disrupt her bookkeeping. And on the left-hand pages, in a narrower hand, the other record. The other record was not a diary and not a journal, and Judith was specific about what it was in the entry that opened it, which reads, "This book is a record of the rule, and of what I know about the rule, and of what the rule requires. I am writing it because I promised Edmund I would keep the door open, and I intend to keep it open for the rest of my life, and I intend, when I can no longer keep it open myself, to leave this record for whoever comes after me so that they understand what they are being asked to do. The rule requires keeping. The keeping requires understanding. I do not fully understand. I am going to record what I know and what I observe and what I come to understand, and I hope that the record will be useful to someone after me who needs it. She was 43 years old. She was a woman of the post-war Virginia upper class, which meant she had been raised with certain expectations and certain comforts that the war had entirely disrupted, and she had reorganized herself in relation to the disruption with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did. And the reorganized version of Judith Carver was, by the testimony of everyone who knew her in the 1870s and 1880s, considerably more formidable than the pre-war version had been. She managed the estate herself without an estate manager after Edmund's death. She paid fair wages. This is documented in the account books and is notable for the period, to the freedmen and freedwomen who worked the land and the house. She attended the county's civic meetings and was largely ignored at them in the way that women of the period were largely ignored at civic meetings. And she attended anyway, because not attending was not something she did. She also went to the cellar every morning. She went every morning to check the door, to confirm that it was open by its 6 inches, and if the gap had narrowed, which happened sometimes, for reasons she could not account for, the door settling in its frame, the house shifting in the winter cold, the hinges responding to moisture in the cellar air. She pushed it back to 6 inches, and she noted it in the record book, and she moved on with her day. The record book from 1871 to 1895 is a document of extraordinary patience and extraordinary attention. Judith recorded the door's condition every morning. She recorded the weather and the season and the condition of the cellar, which was damp in winter and dry in August, and always cold and always dark except for the lamp she carried. She recorded the occasions when the gap had narrowed and what she had done to restore it. She recorded the occasions when the house felt different. Her word, in the record book, is different, which is the word of a woman who knows that what she is trying to describe does not have a more precise vocabulary available to it, and who is not going to pretend it does. The occasions when the house felt different were always connected to the door. She came to understand this through the record. It was the record that revealed the pattern, as Margaret Halcro's assembled dossier had revealed the pattern of the border towers, as any systematic record reveals the pattern that individual observation cannot see. When the gap narrowed beyond a certain point, when it fell below perhaps 3 inches, the house felt different, and the different had a specific quality that Judith documented with increasing precision over the years of the record. In the first year she described it as a quality of pressure, as if the house has been holding something and is beginning to be unable to hold it. In the third year she described it as, the cold is not the cellar cold. The cold that comes when the door is nearly closed is a different cold. It is the cold of something that has been under pressure and is now moving into spaces it has not previously occupied. In the 7th year she described it as, I can hear it when the gap closes too far. Not sound exactly. The quality of something that is on the other side of the quiet. The way you hear something when the house is entirely still, and the night is entirely still, and what you hear is not a sound but the absence of something that was previously present, which is the silence of something that has stopped holding itself in place. In the 12th year she wrote, I do not know who they are. I do not know their names or which side they were on or how many of them are in that ground. Edmund knew more than he told me, and he died with most of it. What I know is that they are there, and that the door being open is the only acknowledgement this house makes of the fact that they are there. If I close the door, I am agreeing with the house that they are not there, and the house is not right about this, and neither would I be. She also wrote, in the record book's entry for the 4th of July 1876, the centennial of the nation's founding, a date that Judith seems to have chosen deliberately for what she wrote. I am going to say this plainly and put it in this record because it is the thing I understand most clearly, and it is the thing that Edmund could not say, and that the architecture cannot say, and that the America being celebrated today with its cannons and its flags is not going to say, which is why I am saying it here in this book, on this day, in this cellar. The war did not end in 1865. The dying ended mostly, for white people mostly, and the fighting ended, and the flag changed, and the names of the things changed. But the thing the war was about, the thing that had always been about what it was about, from before the war and into the war and through the war and out the other side of it, that thing did not end. They put it in the ground. They put it in the ground the way you put a thing in a sealed room and close the door and call it settled. And the thing in the sealed room is not settled. And closing the door does not settle it. And I know this because I have been living above a sealed room with an open door for 9 years, and I have felt what happens when the door gets too close to closed. And what happens is that the sealed thing pushes back. It always pushes back. The question is not whether it pushes back, but whether you have the courage to keep the door open. Whether you can stand to acknowledge what is in the ground every morning with the lamp and the 6 inches of gap and say, yes, they are there. This house is standing on what they are. Yes, they are there. The record book is the most extraordinary document that Delia Marsh had ever read when she opened it in October of 1895. She would say this many times afterward, in many different contexts, for the rest of her life. And she would say it with the specific conviction of someone who has read a great many extraordinary documents and knows the difference between extraordinary and merely remarkable. Delia Marsh was 29 years old in October of 1895. She was a black woman from Richmond, Virginia, the daughter of a freedman who had worked in the Richmond tobacco warehouses after emancipation, and who had, with a determination that his daughter had inherited and intensified, ensured that she was educated, privately at first, through the network of freedmen's schools that had flourished briefly in the Reconstruction period, and had been systematically dismantled in the years of redemption that followed, and then through correspondence and self-teaching, and the specific hard acquisition of knowledge that is available to someone who cannot access the institutions, but who is determined to access the knowledge anyway. She worked for a church-affiliated historical society in Richmond, whose purpose was the documentation and location of unmarked graves of black Virginians, primarily from the war years and the immediate post-war period. The society had been founded in 1887 by a minister named Caleb Harrison who had understood, with the clarity of a man whose congregation included people who had lost family members to the war and to the violence that followed, and who had never been able to find where those family members were buried, that the unrecorded dead were a wound that would not close until they were recorded. The society documented, located, petitioned for markers, wrote letters to county officials who mostly did not respond, maintained its own archive, and trained its researchers, of whom Delia was the most skilled, to read landscape the way a botanist reads a specimen, to understand what the ground said about what was in it. She came to Culpeper County in the autumn of 1895, following a reference in a letter from the Freedmen's Bureau archive. A letter written in 1866 by a bureau agent who had noted, in the course of his duties, that the Carver land in Culpeper County showed signs of having been used as a disposal site during the fighting of 1863, that several local people had confirmed the presence of bodies on the north end of the property, and that no official disposition of these remains had been undertaken. The bureau agent had written the letter and filed it, and nothing had happened, as nothing happened to a great many bureau letters in the late 1860s, when the bureau was being systematically defunded, and its work dismantled by the political forces that had never wanted it to succeed. The letter had sat in the archive for 29 years. Delia found it in September of 1895 and wrote to Judith Carver requesting permission to survey the north end of the property, identifying herself and the society and their purpose plainly and directly, because Delia did not do things any other way. Judith's response came within a week. It was 2 sentences long. The first sentence said, "Yes, come." The second sentence said, "Bring time because there is more here than the ground and you will need to understand the more before the ground will make sense." Delia arrived on the 14th of October with her survey equipment and her notebook and her particular quality of attention, which had been described by Caleb Harrison as the kind of attention that makes a place tell you things it has not been willing to tell anyone else, which was the kind of observation that ministers make about people who have a gift for a particular kind of work, and which Delia received without vanity and without false modesty, because vanity and false modesty were both inefficient. Judith met her at the door. They looked at each other for a moment in the way of two women who have been corresponding with precision and who are now calibrating the correspondence against the person, and the calibration on both sides was apparently satisfying because Judith said, "Come inside and have something to eat before I take you to the cellar," and Delia said, "Is the cellar the most important thing?" and Judith said, "The cellar is the first thing," and Delia said, "Then I'll eat after." Judith took her through the house in the specific way of someone who has lived with a thing for 24 years and has developed a precise route to it that moves efficiently through everything irrelevant, through the front hall, through the parlor, through the door to the service corridor, down the stairs to the cellar, which Judith navigated in the dark for the first 12 steps before lighting the lamp at the bottom, which was a detail Delia noted because it meant Judith could do this in the dark, which meant she had done it in the dark, which meant the regularity of the practice was deeper than a conscious daily discipline. The cellar was cold and large and smelled of earth and lamp oil and the specific mineral smell of old stone. Judith led her through it with the lamp, past the shelved walls of the domestic cellar, preserved vegetables, wine, the ordinary stores of a large household, to the north end. Delia saw the door before Judith said anything about it. She saw it and she stopped walking. She stopped because of the gap, the 6 inches of open dark at the door's edge. The door in its gap had a quality she had felt before its sites the society had documented, the specific quality of a place that knows what it contains and is not pretending otherwise, the quality of honest ground, which was not the same as peaceful ground, and was not the same as safe ground, but was the specific quality of a place that was not lying about itself. The door in its 6 inches of open dark had that quality, and she felt it before she understood it, the way you feel certain things before you understand them. She said, "How long has the door been open?" Judith said, "Since 1865. Edmund built it open. I have kept it open." Delia looked at the door for a long time. She said, "Who is on the other side of it?" Judith said, "That is the question I have been trying to answer for 24 years. Come inside and read the record book." They sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours with the record book between them and 2 lamps burning and the afternoon light coming through the windows, and Judith told Delia everything. The construction, Edmund's supervision of the cellar, the clay floor he had laid himself, the night before his death and the rule, and the 24 years of the record. She told it the way she had written it in the record book, which was plainly and with precision and without the softening of retrospect, because the softening of retrospect was something Judith had no use for. Delia read the record book from its beginning, the 1871 entry that stated its purpose, through the accounts of the door's condition across 24 years, through the entry of July the 4th, 1876, through the later entries of the 1880s and 1890s, in which Judith's understanding of the rule had deepened without becoming complete, to the final entry, which was dated October the 1st, 1895, 13 days before Delia's arrival, and which read, "A woman from Richmond is coming. She works for a society that documents the unrecorded dead. I have read her letter several times. I believe she is the person the record book has been waiting for. I believe Edmund, who was a precise man, knew that eventually the right person would come, and that the record book needed to be legible to that person, and that he gave me the rule knowing I would make it legible. I have made it legible. I am going to give it to her and trust the rest to her." Delia put the record book down on the table. She said, "The society needs to survey the North Field." Judith said, "I know." Delia said, "The bureau agent's letter mentioned multiple," she paused, "multiple sets of remains." She said it carefully, because she was in a white woman's kitchen in 1895 Virginia, and she had spent her professional life calibrating the care required for each conversation, without sacrificing the accuracy of the things she was trying to say. And Judith Carver's record book was the record of a woman who deserved accuracy over care, which made this conversation easier than most. Judith said, "Edmund said they are in the north field, into the ground past the garden wall. He said there were men from the fighting in '63. He said they were not moved when they should have been moved." Delia said, "The bureau agent's letter said the same thing. He also said that there were people in the ground from before the fighting, from before '63. She watched Judith's face, which did not change in any way Delia could specifically identify, but which became somehow more present, more attending, the way a face does when something arrives that was expected. Judith said, "Edmund never said that to me." Delia said, "I know, but the bureau agent's informants did. They told him the ground had been used before, that the land on the north end of the Carver property, and it was Carver land then, Edmund's father's land, had been used before the fighting of '63 for things that were not marked and not recorded, and that a great many local people knew about and did not speak of for reasons that were not complicated." She said this and she let it sit, because it did not need elaboration, and elaboration would have been an insult to Judith's understanding of what the word reasons meant in a sentence about the antebellum South, and what it contained, and what it did not record. Judith was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He built the cellar in the specific place. He chose the specific place and he laid the clay floor himself and he built the room and the door." She said, "Edmund, he knew. Not just about '63, she said, "Oh, Edmund." She was quiet again. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" Delia said, "Permission to survey the north field. Access to whatever records Edmund kept, the construction records, the accounts, anything from before and during the war. Time." Judith said, "You have all of that." She pushed the record book across the table. She said, "You have this too." She said, "I have been writing the record for the person who would know what to do with it. You are the person." Delia took the record book and held it in both hands, which was something she did with documents that mattered, a habit from the society's training, the physical acknowledgement of the weight of what you were holding. She said, "I need to look at the door again before we do anything else." They went back to the cellar. They stood in front of the door, in front of its 6 inches of dark, and Delia looked at it with the quality of attention that Caleb Harrison had identified as her specific gift, and after a while she said, "I can feel the honesty of it." She said this like it was a material property she was recording, which it was. She said, "Most doors lie. They pretend the wall is a wall. This one doesn't pretend." She looked at the gap. She said, "He was trying to do the only thing available to him, wasn't he? He couldn't name it and he couldn't undo it and he couldn't make it right, but he could refuse to close the door on it." Judith said, "That is the best thing anyone has said about Edmund in 30 years. Delia put her hand flat on the door, not in the gap, on the wood itself, on the outside face of it. She felt the door under her palm. Then she said, "I'm going to go look at the north field now." She surveyed the north field for 3 days. She worked with the systematic method the society had developed over 8 years of this specific work. The grid survey, the soil sampling, the botanical observation of what grew where and how, because the society had learned that the ground expressed its contents through the plants that grew from it, that certain species colonized disturbed burial ground with a specificity that made them reliable indicators, that the ground was not silent about what it held if you knew the vocabulary the ground used. She worked alone, which she preferred, which Judith respected without comment. She came in at noon to eat and to note the morning's findings in her own notebook, and to ask Judith questions about the construction records, which Edmund had kept, which were in a box in the study that no one had opened since his death, which Judith had known were there, and had not opened because the opening of them had felt like something that required a specific occasion, and the specific occasion was this. And then she went back out to the north field. The north field in October was past its summer growth, the grass brown and the late annuals finished, and in the flat low light of the October afternoon, The ground showed things it did not show in the full green of summer. She could see the variations in the soil. She could see the places where the ground had settled differently from the surrounding field, the slight depressions that were the long-term consequence of disturbed earth below, the way that ground above an unfilled space eventually subsides, the mathematical patience of gravity applied to loose soil over 30 years. She could count the depressions. She counted them and she put them in her notebook, and she did not say the number aloud until she had counted them 3 times and was certain. She sat in the north field in the October afternoon with her notebook, and she looked at the ground, and she thought about the men who were in it. She thought about the ones Edmund had mentioned, from the fighting in '63. And she thought about the ones the Bureau agents' informants had described, the ones from before, the ones whose presence in the ground predated the war by years or decades, and who had been placed there in the particular darkness of what the antebellum South put in the ground and did not mark, and expected the ground to keep quiet about. She thought about what the ground had been asked to keep quiet about, and she thought about the door, and she understood Edmund Carver with the specific understanding of a person who has spent 8 years learning to read unacknowledged ground, and who has developed, in the course of that reading, a precise and uncomfortable knowledge of the relationship between what is kept and what keeps it. He had known. He had known what was in the north field, all of it, or most of it, or enough of it, and he had known because some portion of what was in the north field was connected to what Edmund's family had done on the Carver land before the war, and the door in the cellar was not only about the soldiers of 1863. The door in the cellar was about all of it. It was about the whole weight of the thing that the north field contained, which was the war and also what came before the war and which the war was about. And Edmund had found the only architecture available to him for acknowledging the whole of it, which was a door that stayed open so that the house could not pretend to itself that the ground below it was empty. She sat in the north field for a long time. Then she took out her pen and her notebook and she began to write the names. She did not have many names. The Bureau records and the letters she had found in the Richmond archive gave her some, and Judith's record book gave her others. The name of a man mentioned in the construction records of 1865, whose account of the land's history Edmund had written down in a cramped margin notation. The name of a woman referenced in a county record that Judith had located in 1882 and inserted into the record book with a note that said, "I don't know if she is in the north field. I believe she may be. I think she should be in the record. She is in the record." She wrote the names she had. Then she drew a line and she wrote, "Unknown." Under unknown, she wrote everything she knew about the ones she did not have names for, what the Bureau agent had recorded, what the Society's method could determine from the ground itself, what the ground said in its own vocabulary about how many and from what period and from what circumstances. She wrote it all down in the notebook, and then she closed the notebook and she sat with the ground and she sat with the names. She said, quietly, to the north field in the October afternoon, in the same voice she used when she stood at the grave sites she had documented for the Society, and said what she always said at the end of a documentation. "We know you are here. We are going to make sure the record says so. We are going to make sure you are not asked to stay quiet any longer than you already have." She said, "I'm sorry it took so long." The north field was quiet around her. The late afternoon light lay flat on the brown grass. From the house, 200 yards south across the lawn, she could see the cellar window at ground level, a narrow rectangle at the base of the foundation. And through the cellar window, faint, steady, the amber thread of the lamp Judith lit every morning when she went to check the door. Open, Delia thought, looking at the amber thread. Still open. She spent 6 weeks at Carver's Landing. She completed the survey of the north field and produced a full report for the Society documenting the evidence of the disturbed ground and the number of apparent burial sites and the historical sources corroborating the field evidence. She wrote to the County Historical Commission and to the state government and to the United States Army, which maintained records of identified and unidentified Civil War burials, requesting official acknowledgement of the site and asking about the possibility of formal marking or eventual disinterment and proper reburial. The army responded. The County Historical Commission did not. The state government did not. These responses were, Delia noted in her own correspondence from this period, entirely predictable and entirely inadequate, and she filed them under the heading of ongoing rather than under the heading of resolved, because this was the filing system her work required. She also sat with Judith for many evenings in those 6 weeks. They sat in the parlor or at the kitchen table or, on the warmer evenings of the early part of her visit, on the rear porch looking out at the north field, and they talked. They talked about the record book and about Edmund and about the nature of the rule, which Delia understood in a way that Judith had been trying to understand alone for 24 years, and which the two of them understood better together than either had understood separately. They talked about what the society did and how it worked, and about Caleb Harrison, who Judith described after hearing about him as a man doing what should be done by governments, and doing it because governments will not, which Delia said was an accurate description. They talked about the incident. The one time the door had closed. Judith had referenced it in the record book briefly, without full description, noting only that in the winter of 1865, before her arrival, Edmund had closed the door to see what would happen, and that something had happened that had not been described. Delia asked about it directly one evening in the parlor when the fire was built up, and the lamps were high, and the house was as warm as it ever got. Because some things can only be asked when the conditions for the asking are maximally present. Judith was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He didn't tell me what happened. He told me he closed it and that something happened and that he opened it again immediately." She said, "But I know what it felt like when the gap got too narrow, even in all the years after, even when the door only closed by a few inches more than usual, and I can extrapolate from that. From what it felt like when the gap was too small." She paused. She said, "It is like a house that has been holding its breath, releasing it. That is the simplest way to say it. A held breath released. And the release is not a relief. It is a pressure in the air, a movement of something from the cellar upward through the house, a cold that is not the cellar cold, that moves the way cold does not naturally move, which is upward through the floors into the rooms, and the cold carries with it." She stopped. She said, "It carries something that I do not have a word for, not sound, not smell, something the body registers without the ordinary senses, a knowing. A specific knowing that you are not alone in the house, and that what you are not alone with has been in the ground a very long time, and is not comfortable and is not peaceful, and is not going to let you pretend that everything is all right, because everything is not all right, and the thing in the ground knows this. And when the door closes, even for a moment, the thing in the ground reminds the house of what it knows." Delia said, "And when the door is open?" Judith said, "When the door is open, it is quiet, not the quiet of absence, the quiet of acknowledgement, the quiet of something that is being seen and knows it is being seen and does not need to press against the walls because it is not being denied." Delia said, "Edmund understood this." Judith said, "Edmund built it in because he understood it, because he could not say it in words and he could not undo what was done, and the one thing he could do was build a house that kept the door open. That refused the denial." Delia said, "Do you think it is enough?" Judith was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "No, I think it is not enough. I think the only thing that would be enough would be names on markers above ground and someone to tend them, and an official record that said plainly what happened here and who decided it was all right for it to happen here, and why they decided that and what it cost the people it cost. I think nothing less than that is enough. But I think the door is the only thing available in this house, in this architecture, in this particular moment of history. And I think a thing that is not enough is better than nothing. And I think the keeping of the door open is the difference between a house that knows it is a lie and a house that has agreed to be a lie. And Edmund was not willing to agree to the lie, and neither am I." She said, "Is it enough for you? In terms of what you do, what the society does, is there a point at which the door is a sufficient acknowledgement?" Delia said, No, the door is not a sufficient acknowledgement. The door is what exists until the sufficient acknowledgement is made, which it has not been made and which will not be made easily, and which I am going to spend the rest of my working life trying to make happen. She said, "The door is a placeholder. It is what a person of conscience does when they understand the problem but do not have the power to solve the problem. It holds the space open for the solution." She looked at the fire for a moment. She said, "I think Edmund knew that. I think the door was never meant to be permanent. I think it was meant to be there until something better was available, and it has been there this long because something better has not yet been made available." She said, "I am working on the something better." Judith looked at her. She said, "I know." Delia Marsh left Carver's Landing on the 29th of November 1895, 6 weeks after she had arrived. She took the record book, with Judith's full permission, and with the understanding that the Society's archive was where it belonged, that Judith's 24 years of documentation were part of the larger record that the Society was building, that the record book and the Society's survey of the North Field and the Bureau agent's letter, and the margin notation in Edmund's construction records were pieces of a single document that had been written across 30 years by people who could not all hear each other, and that needed to be assembled in one place where they could be read together. She also took a copy of the rule. She wrote it out in her own hand on a separate sheet, and she put it in the record book and she took it with her, because the rule needed to be in the archive alongside everything else, because the rule was itself a historical document, the document of a man who understood something he could not say and said it in architecture instead. The rule was this: the door in the cellar of the north end of the house, the door behind the false front that faces north in the lowest level of the foundation, must never be fully closed. It must remain open by a minimum of 6 inches at all times. If it is found closed, open it immediately. This is not a preference. This is a requirement. She kept her own copy of the rule in her working files for the rest of her life. When she founded her own historical research organization in 1908, after Caleb Harrison's death, she kept the copy in the organization's first archive box, the founding document of what would become, over the following decades, one of the most significant repositories of documentation of unmarked graves in the mid-Atlantic South. She was asked many times over the years why she kept the rule. She was asked by colleagues, by historians, by journalists who interviewed her in the 1920s and 1930s, when the organization's work had achieved a public profile that was larger than anything she had anticipated when she had written her first letter to Judith Carver in 1895. She was asked what it meant to keep the rule of a door in a dead Confederate engineer's cellar, in the archive of an organization dedicated to the dignity and documentation of the people that Confederate Engineers Society had enslaved and killed. She had a specific answer to this question, which she gave consistently across the decades, which was this: the door is not Edmund Carver's rule. The door is what the ground taught Edmund Carver. The door is what the ground teaches anyone who is willing to stand next to it and be honest about what is in it. Edmund Carver was not a good man. He did things that I will not excuse and that the record documents clearly. But he understood something in the end, in the way that certain people understand things when the thing they have done is pressing against them, from the inside the way, the ground pressed against the door. He understood that you cannot seal the truth of what you have done below a foundation and call the house above it a home. He understood that the door open is the only honest thing, and he built it in. He built the acknowledgement into the architecture. He did not do it well enough, and he did not do it soon enough, and he did not do it in a way that made adequate reparation for anything. And the door has been open for 130 years, and the names are still not all on markers, and the record is still not complete. But the door was open. He built it open. He gave Judith the rule, and Judith kept it alone for 24 years, every morning with the lamp, checking the 6 inches of gap, because she understood that the gap was the only true thing in a house built on ground that deserved better than a house built on it. She said, I keep the rule in the archive because the rule is the document of what a conscience looks like when it doesn't have enough power to do what conscience requires, and we should know what that looks like. We should know because we live in it. The door open is what we have. What we are working toward is something better than the door open. The archive is the something better. The record is the something better. The names on the markers, when we finally put them there, are the something better. But until then, the door. Judith Carver died in the spring of 1902. She was 74 years old, and she had maintained the rule for 31 years, which was the whole of her time at Carver's Landing after Edmund's death. And she was, by the account of everyone who had known her in those years, exactly the same at the end of it as she had been at the beginning of it, precise, patient, formidable in the way of women who have decided what they are going to do, and have done it for 31 years without any external validation of the decision. Her will left Carver's Landing to a trust, and the trust's terms included the rule. The rule was in the trust's founding document in the same language Edmund had given Judith the night before he died. The door in the cellar must never be fully closed. It must remain open by a minimum of 6 inches at all times. If it is found closed, open it immediately. The trust held the house through 2 subsequent families who lived in it as tenants and who were given the rule, and told to maintain it, and who maintained it. As people maintain the rules of the spaces they live in when the rules are clearly stated, and the house makes the violation of them uncomfortable in ways that are difficult to explain to a county assessor or a building inspector, but are nevertheless compelling to anyone who has felt the house when the gap narrows past the point of tolerance. The house is still standing, the door is still open. The north field has a marker now, installed in 1967 by the organization that Delia Marsh founded, which became part of a larger network of Civil War burial documentation efforts in the 1960s, and then part of the federal documentation program in the 1990s, and which now has a small plaque in bronze, weathered green with the years. That lists the names. It has 23 names in total, some with full information, some with only a first name or a partial record, some listed only as unknown with a date range, and a brief notation of what the documentary evidence establishes about their presence in this ground. 23 names is not all of them. The organization's current researchers believe the actual number is between 40 and 60. The work of establishing the rest of the names is ongoing. At the bottom of the marker's plaque, below the names, Delia Marsh had requested, in the letter she wrote to the organization before she died in 1941, the letter that specified what the marker should say when it was finally installed, a single line. It reads, "The door has been open since 1865. Now the names are here too. The door is open. The house stands on what it stands on, as all houses stand on what they stand on. And the question that the door has been asking since Edmund Carver hung it in its frame in the autumn of 1865, the question that Judith kept open for 31 years, and that Delia read out of the record book and took to the archive and held in the organization's files, and built the rest of her working life around. The question is not complicated. The question is the oldest question a building can ask about the ground it is built on. Do you know what is here? Do you know what you are standing on? And the answer that the door open insists upon, the answer that 6 inches of gap in the darkness of the cellar has been insisting upon for 160 years, is not an answer that closes. It is an answer that stays open. It is the answer that says, yes, we know, we are standing on it. We are not pretending we are standing on solid ground, on neutral ground, on ground that has no history that needs naming. We are standing on what we are standing on, and we have not closed the door on what it is. This is the warning. This is what Carver's Landing has been saying in the only language a house has for 160 years. The darkness of what was done does not disappear when the building goes up. It does not go anywhere. It waits below the foundation with the specific patience of things that have been given no alternative to patience. And if you close the door on it, if you seal the lid on it and call the house above it a home and go about the ordinary business of domestic life, without the 6 inches of gap in the cellar, and the lamp in the morning, and the daily acknowledgement that what is in the ground is in the ground, it will press. It will find the cracks in the architecture. It will rise in the cold that moves upward when cold does not naturally move upward. It will be in the house with you, in the way that what is unacknowledged is always in the house with you, which is without your permission and without your ability to make it leave. Because you cannot make something leave that has not been acknowledged as present, and you cannot acknowledge it as present without opening the door. And the door is the only thing Edmund Carver knew how to do about the thing he had done. And it was not enough, and it was what there was, and it has been keeping the house honest for 160 years. Keep the door open. Keep the door open. This is the historical warning. This is the whole of it, spoken plainly to you here now, because the architecture has been speaking it quietly for longer than we have been listening, and it is time to listen. The door is open, the names are there, the work is not finished, keep the door open.